Hello, my friends. If you are listening to this right now, there is a good chance that the day has finally gone quiet, but your mind has not. Night has a way of doing that. When the world slows down, old thoughts begin to move again, and grief, especially the kind we thought we had already understood, can return without asking, not to overwhelm us, but simply to be felt once more. Welcome to Sleepy Zen. Here, we share gentle Zen stories inspired by Buddhist teachings, not to fix your sadness or stop your thinking, but to sit beside them with steadiness and care. Tonight's stories are about overthinking when grief returns at night, and how the mind can soften when we stop trying to think our way out of feeling. As you listen, you are invited to rest your body and let the stories do the walking. If you feel comfortable, take a moment to leave a comment and tell us where you are in the world and what time it is right now. For now, there is nothing you need to solve. Just listen. Emily had learned to dread the moment her head touched the pillow. The room would be quiet, the lights already off, her phone placed face down on the small table beside the bed. Nothing around her was demanding attention anymore, and that was exactly when her mind began to speak the loudest. It always started the same way, with a simple sentence that sounded almost harmless. If only I had said something different. If only I had stayed a little longer. If only I had noticed sooner. Each thought arrived dressed as logic, as responsibility, as care, and because it sounded reasonable, Emily followed it. She would replay small scenes from the past with sharp precision, conversations she could recite word for word, moments she had already examined dozens of times. Her mind moved quickly, jumping from one version of events to another, each one ending with the same quiet ache in her chest. The more she thought, the more tired she became, yet stopping felt impossible. It was as if the thinking itself had taken on a momentum of its own, and she was being carried along by it, awake in the dark. One night, unable to sleep, Emily got out of bed and went to the kitchen. The apartment was dim, lit only by a small lamp above the counter. She noticed a single cup left in the sink from earlier that evening. Without much thought, she turned on the tap and began to wash it. The water was warm, the sound steady and uncomplicated. As she rinsed the cup, she became aware that her thoughts were still running, but something about the simple action made them slightly less convincing. They were there, but they no longer felt like commands. She stood at the sink longer than necessary, drying the cup slowly, placing it back in its spot. For a brief moment, her mind rested on the feeling of her hands, the warmth, the quiet, and then, just as naturally, the thoughts returned. If only. The sentence came back again. almost on cue. Emily sighed, frustrated. Even now, even here, it would not leave her alone. The next day, she mentioned this to a teacher she occasionally listened to online. Someone who spoke about Buddhist practice in simple everyday language. She did not ask how to stop the thoughts. She had asked that question too many times already. Instead, she said, "Why does my mind do this every night? Why can it not let go?" The answer surprised her. Overthinking, the teacher said, is often grief looking for a place to land. It feels like questions, but it is not actually asking for answers. Emily sat with that sentence for a long time. Grief looking for a place to land. She realized that every if only was carrying the same feeling underneath. Sadness, longing, love that had nowhere to go. That night, when she went to bed, the thoughts returned just as before. Nothing magical had changed, but instead of chasing them, Emily tried something different. When the first if only appeared, she did not follow it forward or push it away. She noticed the tightness in her chest that came with it. She noticed how tired her body felt. She let the thought exist without asking it to lead her somewhere. At first, this felt unnatural, almost irresponsible. Part of her believed that if she stopped thinking, she was giving up on something important. But slowly, she began to see that the thinking was not solving anything. It was circling the same emotional center again and again, hoping repetition would turn into relief. As the night deepened, the thoughts continued to rise and fall. Some were loud, some barely formed. Emily did not label them or argue with them. She simply recognized them as movement, not instruction. Grief, she understood now, was not asking her to fix the past. It was asking to be acknowledged, to be allowed to exist without being interrogated. Eventually, her breathing softened. The thoughts were still there, but they lost their urgency. They no longer demanded immediate answers. And in that space, small and imperfect as it was, rest became possible. Emily did not wake up the next morning cured of sadness or free from overthinking, but something had shifted. She had learned that when the mind spins at night, it is often not because it has found an important problem to solve, but because an old feeling has resurfaced, hoping to be seen. Overthinking, she realized, is not always a sign of confusion. Sometimes it is simply grief knocking gently, asking not for answers, but for permission to stay. Emily noticed the change not as a sudden peace, but as a subtle loosening. The nights were still quiet, and the thoughts still arrived, but they no longer felt like an emergency. When the familiar sentence appeared, "If only I had," she began to recognize it the way one recognizes a passing sound outside the window. It was there. It had a shape, but it did not require pursuit. Some nights, she still followed it for a while before remembering. Other nights, she noticed it early and let it drift by on its own. She realized that what exhausted her was not grief itself, but the constant attempt to turn grief into a problem with a solution. Each thought had felt like a responsibility, as if failing to think hard enough meant failing to care. Yet the more she watched her mind, the clearer it became that the caring was already there, quietly present beneath the noise. The thinking was not proof of love. It was only the mind's habit of motion. One evening, Emily found herself sitting on the edge of the bed, hands resting loosely in her lap, listening to the distant hum of traffic outside. The room felt the same as always, but her relationship to it had changed. She could feel sadness moving through her, but it no longer pulled her forward into endless revision. It simply moved, rose, softened, and shifted again. She understood then that grief did not want to be chased or completed. It wanted space. It wanted permission to exist without being translated into words. This understanding did not come as a comforting thought, but as a bodily relief. Her shoulders dropped slightly, her jaw unclenched. The mind, having nothing urgent to chase, began to slow on its own. Emily saw that when she stopped demanding answers from grief, it stopped disguising itself as questions. What remained was quieter, more honest, and far less frightening. She lay down and allowed herself to rest in that uncertainty. There was no resolution, no final insight to hold on to, just the simple recognition that she did not have to think her way out of feeling. The night held her as it was, imperfect and unfinished, and for the first time in a long while, that was enough. Overthinking often feels like a mental failure, especially at night, when the mind refuses to settle and old sadness resurfaces. But what Emily discovered is something many Buddhist teachings quietly point to. The mind is not always searching for answers. Sometimes it is only trying to give grief a voice. When we mistake that movement for a problem to solve, we add another layer of tension to an already tender experience. Grief, when it returns, does not come with new information. It comes with familiar sensations, familiar weight, familiar longing. The mind, trained to fix and resolve, turns that weight into questions, into imagined alternatives, into endless replay. But those thoughts are not doors leading forward. They are expressions of an emotion that has not yet been allowed to rest. From a Buddhist perspective, overthinking is not an enemy. It is a signal. Not a signal that something is wrong, but that something within us is asking to be acknowledged without being examined. When we stop chasing thoughts and instead notice the feeling beneath them, the mind often settles naturally, not because we forced it to be calm, but because it no longer needs to shout to be heard. This does not mean grief disappears. It means our relationship to it changes. We learn to let sadness exist without turning it into a mental task. We learn that rest does not come from finding the perfect explanation, but from allowing experience to be what it is, moment by moment. In that allowing, the night softens, the mind slows, and sleep, uninvited but welcome, finds its way back on its own. Daniel rarely noticed his sadness during the day. Mornings were structured, filled with routines that carried him forward without much resistance. There were messages to answer, tasks to complete, familiar conversations that asked only for simple responses. His mind stayed occupied, and in that occupation, the grief stayed quiet. It did not disappear, but it remained in the background, like a sound from another room. Night was different. When the lights were turned off and the last distraction was set aside, the silence felt unusually large. Daniel would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. In that stillness, the sadness he had not felt all day began to surface. It did not arrive dramatically. It came slowly, as a heaviness behind the eyes, a tightening in the chest, a vague sense of loss without a clear image attached to it. At first, Daniel believed the silence itself was the problem. He told himself that if he could just keep some noise around him, the sadness would stay away. He left the television on low volume, played old podcasts he barely listened to, even kept the hallway light on so the room would not feel so empty. These things helped for a while, but eventually, the grief found its way through the cracks. It always did. One night, after waking again from shallow sleep, Daniel sat up in bed and noticed how tense his body had become. His shoulders were raised, his jaw clenched, as if he had been bracing himself against something unseen. He realized that he had been fighting the quiet, treating it like an enemy that made his sadness stronger. The thought unsettled him. Was the silence really causing the grief, or was it simply revealing what had been there all along? The next evening, instead of filling the room with sound, Daniel tried something unfamiliar. He turned off the television, set his phone aside, and sat on the edge of the bed without doing anything at all. The quiet felt uncomfortable at first, almost intrusive. His mind immediately began to comment on it, labeling it as lonely, heavy, unbearable. The sadness rose quickly, as if it had been waiting just outside the door. Daniel felt the urge to escape it, to reach for noise, for movement, for anything that would pull him away. But he stayed still. He noticed the sadness as a sensation rather than a story. It was warm and dull, spreading slowly, not sharp or dangerous. The silence, he began to see, was not amplifying the grief. It was simply removing the distractions that usually kept him from noticing it. As the minutes passed, something unexpected happened. The sadness did not grow larger. It stayed the same, steady and contained. The quiet around it did not make it louder or heavier. In fact, the silence gave it a boundary. Without constant stimulation, Daniel could feel where the grief ended and where his body began. He was not swallowed by it. He was sitting with it. This realization changed the way he understood his nights. He had assumed that daytime strength meant nighttime weakness, that being fine during the day should have protected him from feeling sad at night. But now he saw that the day simply kept him busy. The night, in its stillness, offered honesty. It was not that grief became stronger after dark. It was that there was finally enough space to notice it. Daniel lay back down and allowed the room to remain quiet. The clock continued its steady rhythm. The sadness was present, but it no longer felt threatening. He did not try to name it or explain it. He let it exist alongside the silence, neither one needing to be fixed or filled. As his breathing slowed, Daniel understood something subtle but important. Silence does not make grief bigger. It only makes it clearer. And clarity, he realized, is not the same as pain. Sometimes it is simply the beginning of gentler attention. As the nights passed, Daniel became less afraid of the quiet. He still noticed the sadness when it arose, but he no longer treated it as a sign that something was going wrong. Instead, he began to see it as a familiar presence, one that had been waiting patiently beneath the noise of the day. Some evenings, he would sit in the dim room before lying down, allowing the silence to settle around him like a soft frame rather than an empty space. He noticed that when he stopped resisting the quiet, his body responded first. His shoulders relaxed without effort. His breathing slowed on its own. The sadness did not vanish, but it softened, losing the sharp edge that had once made him restless. It became something he could feel without being overtaken by it. The room, unchanged in appearance, felt less oppressive, as if it were no longer demanding anything from him. Daniel began to understand that his habit of filling the silence had been a way of protecting himself from feeling vulnerable. Noise gave him a sense of control, a buffer between himself and the emotions he did not know how to hold. But control, he realized, came at a cost. It kept him in constant motion, never allowing the mind to settle long enough to rest. One evening, he sat beside the window and listened to the distant sounds of traffic fading into the night. He did not analyze what he felt. He simply noticed the rise and fall of sensation, the way grief moved without forming a clear narrative. In that simple attention, the sadness lost its urgency. It was no longer something that needed to be managed or escaped. It was just present, like the quiet itself. Daniel reflected on how often he had judged himself for feeling this way. He had believed that if the sadness returned at night, it meant he had failed to cope properly during the day. But now he saw that this judgment had only deepened his discomfort. The night was not exposing weakness. It was offering truth. And truth, when met without resistance, did not demand correction. As sleep approached, Daniel noticed that the silence no longer felt vast or threatening. It felt neutral, even supportive. The quiet gave his mind a chance to slow, not because he forced it to, but because there was nothing left to push against. The grief remained, but it did not dominate his attention. It shared the space with the steady rhythm of his breath, the faint sounds of the world outside, the simple fact of being present. He understood then that sadness heard in silence is not louder than sadness drowned in noise. It is simply more honest. And honesty, he learned, can be met with gentleness rather than fear. By allowing the quiet to exist, he had given his grief a container instead of a battlefield. Daniel fell asleep without noticing the exact moment it happened. There was no dramatic release, no clear ending to the sadness. There was only a gradual easing, a sense that nothing needed to be added or taken away. The night held both the silence and the grief without judgment, and that was enough. When grief appears more strongly at night, it is easy to believe that silence has somehow made it worse. But silence does not create emotion. It removes the distractions that usually keep us from feeling what is already there. In Buddhist teaching, stillness is not an amplifier of suffering, but a mirror. It shows us the mind as it is, without commentary or disguise. Many people try to protect themselves from this mirror by filling every quiet moment. Yet constant stimulation keeps the nervous system alert, unable to rest. When we allow silence, even briefly, the body begins to settle. Emotions that arise in this space are not new. They are simply no longer hidden. Grief does not grow because the night is quiet. It becomes noticeable because the mind has stopped running. When we understand this, the urge to escape diminishes. We learn to sit with what we feel without assuming it will overwhelm us. Silence becomes a place of honesty rather than fear. By allowing the quiet, we give grief a safe place to be seen and to soften on its own. And in that gentle clarity, the mind naturally begins to rest. Not because the sadness is gone, but because it no longer needs to fight the night. Brother Theo had spent many years studying the teachings. He could speak calmly about impermanence, about non-attachment, about how all experiences arise and pass away. During the day, this understanding felt stable, almost effortless. He moved through his routines with clarity, responding to others with patience, rarely feeling shaken by strong emotion. To anyone watching, he appeared settled, grounded, at ease. Night told a different story. When the monastery grew quiet and the lamps were dimmed, a familiar unease returned. Theo would lie on his mat, eyes open, feeling a dull sadness spread through his chest. There was no clear cause he could point to, no recent loss or conflict demanding attention, and that confused him. He had understood these teachings. Had he not? He had reflected on impermanence again and again. Why, then, did this feeling still arise? The thought unsettled him more than the sadness itself. He noticed his mind turning inward, evaluating, measuring, questioning. If I truly understood, this would not be happening. Each night, the same conclusion formed quietly but firmly. Something in him was still lacking. His sadness became evidence, proof that his understanding was incomplete. One evening, unable to rest, Brother Theo rose and walked slowly through the corridor. The stone floor was cool beneath his feet. Outside, the courtyard was still, the moon casting pale shapes across the ground. He stood there for a long time, breathing, watching his thoughts form and dissolve. The sadness remained steady and unremarkable, yet his resistance to it grew heavier by the minute. The next morning, Theo approached an older monk known for his simplicity. He did not ask how to eliminate the sadness. Instead, he asked, if everything is impermanent, why does this feeling keep returning? What am I missing? The older monk listened without interruption, then looked at Theo gently. Understanding impermanence does not prevent feelings from arising. It only changes how you meet them. That sentence stayed with Theo throughout the day. He realized that he had been using wisdom as a shield, expecting it to block unpleasant experience. When it failed to do so, he turned that failure inward, judging himself. The sadness itself was quiet. The judgment was loud. That night, when the familiar feeling returned, Theo tried something different. Instead of asking why it was there, he simply noticed how he reacted to it. The sadness arose, and immediately the thought followed, I should be beyond this by now. He saw how quickly the mind moved from feeling to self-criticism, how the second movement created far more tension than the first. He lay still and allowed the sadness to exist without commentary. It was neither sharp nor overwhelming. It did not threaten his understanding or contradict the teachings he valued. It was simply a part of human experience, arising as all things do. When he stopped arguing with it, the feeling did not grow. It stayed present, then slowly began to soften, like a sound fading into the distance. Theo recognized that wisdom had not failed him. He had misunderstood its role. The teachings were never meant to erase emotion. They were meant to create space around it. By expecting wisdom to make him immune to sadness, he had turned insight into another form of grasping. As the night deepened, Theo's breath grew slower. The sadness remained, but it no longer carried the weight of disappointment. It was no longer proof of inadequacy. It was simply a passing condition, allowed to arise and allowed to pass in its own time. In the days that followed, Brother Theo began to notice how often he had been measuring himself against an invisible standard. He had assumed that understanding should produce a particular emotional outcome, one that looked calm at all times and untouched by sadness. Whenever his experience did not match that image, he quietly concluded that he had fallen short. This habit, he saw now, had been shaping his nights more than the sadness itself. Each evening, as the monastery settled into stillness, Theo paid closer attention to the moment the feeling arose. It came without warning and without explanation, as natural as the breath entering his body. The difference was in how he met it. Instead of reaching for concepts or repeating familiar teachings to himself, he stayed with the raw sensation. It was soft, heavy, and unhurried. It did not demand analysis. It only asked to be felt. Theo realized that wisdom had been living in his head, while the sadness was living in his body. When he tried to resolve one with the other, both suffered. But when he allowed them to exist in their own places, something eased. The mind stopped trying to correct the heart. The heart stopped resisting the mind. They settled into a quieter relationship. One night, as he lay awake, listening to the distant sounds of insects outside the window, Theo felt a gentle clarity arise. The sadness was still there, but it no longer carried the story of failure. It was not evidence of misunderstanding. It was simply an expression of being alive, of having cared, of having been touched by the world. In that recognition, the feeling lost its sharpness. He remembered the older monk's words and finally understood them not as an idea, but as experience. Wisdom does not prevent feelings from arising. It prevents us from being harmed by them. By removing the demand that emotions conform to understanding, wisdom allows them to move freely without turning into suffering. Theo saw how often people, including himself, use insight as a way to escape discomfort. We tell ourselves we should know better, be better, feel differently. But this only adds another layer of tension. The teachings, he realized, were never meant to be weapons against emotion. They were invitations to allow experience without resistance. As the night wore on, Theo's breathing deepened. The sadness ebbed and flowed, but it no longer pulled him into judgment. He did not feel victorious or resolved. He felt human. And in that humanity, there was an unexpected softness, a permission to rest as he was. Eventually, sleep came quietly, not because the sadness had disappeared, but because there was no longer a struggle around it. The mind, relieved of its self-imposed expectations, settled naturally. Theo understood then that true understanding is not measured by the absence of feeling, but by the absence of conflict with feeling. Many people believe that insight should protect them from sadness. When it does not, they turn that disappointment inward, creating a second layer of suffering. Buddhist teaching does not promise emotional immunity. It offers something more subtle and more sustainable, a way to relate to experience without adding harm. Feelings arise according to conditions. They do not consult our level of understanding before appearing. When we expect wisdom to erase discomfort, we misuse it. But when we allow wisdom to create space, emotions are free to arise and pass without becoming personal failures. Sadness does not mean the teachings have failed. It means we are alive, connected, and responsive. The practice is not to eliminate these feelings, but to meet them without judgment. In doing so, we stop turning natural human experience into a measure of our worth. When understanding and emotion are allowed to coexist, neither needs to dominate. The mind becomes less rigid, the heart becomes less guarded, and in that quiet balance, rest becomes possible, not because we have mastered our feelings, but because we no longer fight them. Sister Arya had been taught to work with the breath from an early age. She knew the instructions well. Slow the inhale, lengthen the exhale, calm the nervous system. During periods of stress, these techniques often helped her regain balance. But when sadness arrived at night, the breath practices she relied on began to feel strangely inadequate. The more carefully she adjusted her breathing, the more aware she became of how unsettled she felt inside. At night, Arya would sit quietly in her small room, hands resting in her lap, eyes closed. As soon as she noticed the familiar heaviness in her chest, she would begin to shape the breath, counting, guiding, correcting. In her mind, the breath became a tool, something to use in order to make the sadness go away. Yet each time she tried, the sadness remained. Sometimes it even intensified, as if resisting her efforts. This frustrated her. She had always believed that proper breathing could resolve most inner disturbances. If it was not working now, she wondered whether she was doing something wrong. Her attention narrowed, focused entirely on technique. The breath became tense, control, no longer natural, and the sadness, pushed aside again and again, waited patiently. One evening, exhausted from effort, Arya stopped trying. She noticed that in her determination to calm herself, she had lost touch with her body. Her breathing felt shallow, disconnected, almost mechanical. She let go of the instructions she had memorized and allowed her breath to return to its own rhythm, uneven and imperfect. As she did, something shifted. The sadness did not disappear, but it felt closer, less abstract. Instead of hovering in her thoughts, it settled into her body, warm and heavy. Arya felt it in her chest, her throat, her belly. It was uncomfortable, but it was also real. She realized that she had been trying to manage sadness from the outside, using breath as a barrier rather than a bridge. She remembered a teaching she had once heard but never fully understood. Do not breathe to change the feeling. Breathe so the feeling has somewhere to live. Sitting there in the quiet, Arya finally grasped what this meant. The breath was not meant to fix the sadness. It was meant to hold it. She allowed her breathing to move naturally, rising and falling without direction. With each inhale, she felt the sadness expand slightly. With each exhale, she felt it settle, not dissolve, not vanish, just settle. The breath and the sadness began to move together, no longer in opposition. Arya noticed how her body responded when she stopped trying to escape. Her shoulders softened, her jaw released. The mind, no longer focused on control, began to quiet. The sadness remained present, but it no longer felt overwhelming. It had found a place to rest. As the night deepened, Arya continued to sit, breathing without expectation. She was not practicing to achieve calm. She was practicing to stay present. And in that presence, the sadness revealed itself, not as an obstacle, but as part of her experience, allowed to move gently within the rhythm of her breath in the nights that followed. Sister Arya no longer approached her breath as a solution. She approached it as companionship. When sadness appeared, she did not prepare to counter it. She simply noticed where it lived in her body and allowed her breathing to meet it there. This small change altered everything. The breath became less of a technique and more of a presence, steady and available. She began to see how often she had treated discomfort as a signal to intervene. The moment sadness arose, she assumed something needed to be done. But now, by staying with the sensation instead of correcting it, she discovered that the body knew how to settle when it was not being directed. The breath, free from instruction, moved more deeply. The sadness, no longer resisted, softened around the edges. One night, Arya felt the sadness rise more strongly than usual. Her instinct was to return to control, to regulate the breath until the feeling receded. But she stayed still. She let the breath be uneven, let the sadness swell and fall with it. She noticed that when she did not interfere, the feeling reached a natural peak and then eased, like a wave completing its movement. This taught her something subtle but profound. Emotions do not need to be managed in order to pass. They need to be allowed. When the body is given permission to feel, it often releases tension on its own. Control had been keeping the sadness suspended, not dissolving it. Arya also noticed how this approach affected her mind. Without the task of fixing, her thoughts slowed. There was nothing to calculate, no goal to achieve. The mind rested in the rhythm of sensation and breath. In that simplicity, the night felt less heavy, not lighter in content, but lighter in effort. She lay down and continued to breathe naturally, allowing sadness and breath to coexist. There was no conflict between them now. The sadness did not demand attention. It simply moved as part of her experience. And as it moved, her awareness remained steady, unforced. Sleep came gradually, without announcement. There was no moment of triumph or release, just a gentle drifting, as if the body had finally been given enough space to do what it knew how to do all along. Arya realized that rest does not require the absence of feeling. It requires the absence of resistance. Many people use the breath as a tool to control emotion. While this can be helpful in certain moments, it can also become another form of avoidance. When we breathe in order to escape feeling, the body remains tense and emotions linger beneath the surface. Buddhist practice offers a different invitation: to let the breath accompany experience, not correct it. Breathing with sadness does not mean amplifying it. It means giving it a place in the body so it does not have to live only in the mind. When emotions are allowed to be felt physically, they often lose their urgency. The nervous system recognizes that it is safe to settle. The breath is not meant to remove discomfort. It is meant to create enough space for discomfort to move naturally. When we stop using the breath as a tool and allow it to be a companion, the struggle softens. And in that softness, the mind rests, not because sadness is gone, but because it is finally being held rather than pushed away. Grace had been making tea for most of her life. People in the village knew her as the herbalist, the one who understood roots, leaves, and quiet remedies. When someone could not sleep, they came to her for a blend meant to calm the nerves. When the body felt heavy, she offered something warming. Her shelves were lined with jars, each carefully labeled, each holding a promise of gentle relief. One evening, long after the shop had closed, Grace sat alone at her small table, a single lamp casting a soft circle of light. Outside, the night was still. She placed a kettle on the stove and waited for the water to heat, listening to the faint sounds of it beginning to stir. There was a familiar heaviness in her chest, one she recognized well. Sadness had returned, unannounced and unhurried. She did not feel alarmed by it. What unsettled her instead was the reflex that followed. Even now, with all her experience, part of her reached instinctively for a solution. Which herb would help this? The mind asked. What blend would soften this feeling? The habit was deeply ingrained. To feel something uncomfortable was to search for a remedy. Grace watched the steam rise from the kettle and noticed how automatic this response had become. For years, she had offered others something to ease their discomfort, and often it worked. But sitting there alone, she knew that what she was feeling was not something her jars were meant to fix. This sadness was quiet, familiar, and strangely intimate. It did not feel like an illness. It felt like a visitor. She poured the hot water over a small handful of leaves and waited. As the tea steeped, she held the cup in both hands, feeling the warmth seep slowly into her palms. The sadness did not change. It did not lift or fade. It simply stayed, steady and present. Grace noticed that her urge to do something was stronger than the sadness itself. The desire to fix, to adjust, to improve was where most of her tension lived. She remembered something an old teacher had once said to her many years ago. Not every discomfort is a problem. At the time, she had nodded politely and moved on. Now, sitting in the quiet with her tea, the words returned with a different weight. What if this sadness did not need to be treated? What if it did not require a solution at all? Grace took a slow sip. The tea was warm and grounding, but it did not erase what she felt. And that was when she understood. The tea was not there to cure the sadness. It was there to accompany it, to make sitting with it more gentle, not to make it disappear. She allowed herself to sit without expectation. The sadness moved subtly, rising and settling, but it no longer felt urgent. She was not waiting for it to end. She was simply sharing the space with it. The cup warmed her hands. The night remained quiet. Nothing needed to change for the moment to be complete. As she sat, Grace realized how often people come to her believing that every feeling must be corrected. She had participated in that belief without questioning it. But now she saw that some emotions are not signs of imbalance. They are signs of depth, of having lived, of having cared. Trying to remove them too quickly only adds another layer of restlessness. The kettle cooled. The lamp flickered softly. Grace finished her tea and remained seated, unhurried. The sadness did not vanish, but it softened, no longer pressing for attention. It had been allowed to exist without being managed. She understood then that there are feelings no remedy is meant to cure. They are not symptoms. They are part of the human rhythm. And sometimes the most healing act is not to fix what arises, but to sit with it quietly, hands warm around a cup, letting the night be exactly as it is. In the days that followed, Grace carried that evening with her like a quiet reminder. She still prepared remedies for others, still spoke gently about calming the body and easing the nerves. But something in her understanding had shifted. She no longer believed that every inner discomfort needed a cure. Some feelings, she saw now, asked only for presence. On nights when sadness returned, Grace continued her simple ritual. She heated water, chose a mild blend, and sat with her cup without expectation. She did not drink the tea as a treatment. She drank it as companionship. The warmth grounded her in her body, keeping her from drifting into analysis or impatience. The sadness, no longer treated as a problem, began to settle more easily. She noticed how different this felt from her old habit of searching for relief. When she stopped asking, "How do I fix this?" the mind relaxed. There was no longer a sense of urgency, no timeline for improvement. The sadness did not have to prove anything. It was allowed to come and go in its own way. One evening, as she sat by the window watching the darkness deepen outside, Grace reflected on how often people confuse comfort with correction. They believe that to be gentle with themselves means to remove discomfort as quickly as possible. But true gentleness, she realized, often looks like patience. It looks like staying when there is nothing to improve. She felt the sadness rise and fall as she sipped her tea. It did not demand attention. It did not tell a story. It simply moved, quietly and naturally. Grace's body responded by softening, as if relieved that it no longer needed to defend itself. The room felt calm, not because sadness was gone, but because there was no struggle with it. This understanding deepened her compassion for others. When people came to her seeking relief, she still offered what she could, but she also listened differently. She did not rush to solve. She allowed space for their feelings to be spoken without immediately turning them into symptoms. In that space, she noticed people often relaxed before any remedy was given. As night settled in, Grace finished her tea and placed the cup gently back on the table. The sadness lingered softly, like a familiar melody playing in the background. It no longer felt heavy or intrusive. It felt integrated, part of the moment rather than something separate from it. She went to bed without needing the sadness to leave first. Sleep arrived slowly, carried by the same patience that had allowed her to sit with herself. There was no sense of victory, only quiet acceptance. Many of us are trained to believe that discomfort signals something wrong. We search for solutions, techniques, or explanations to make feelings disappear. While this approach can be helpful at times, it can also prevent us from resting with what is already present. Buddhist teaching reminds us that not every feeling is an illness, and not every emotion requires intervention. Some forms of sadness are not asking to be healed. They are asking to be acknowledged. When we stop treating emotion as a problem, the nervous system often settles on its own. The body recognizes safety not through correction, but through presence. Gentleness does not always mean improvement. Sometimes it means allowing ourselves to sit with what is, without demanding change. In doing so, we remove the pressure that keeps emotions tense. And in that unforced space, rest becomes possible. Not because sadness is gone, but because it no longer needs to be pushed away. Jonas had learned to keep his hands busy at night. During the day, his work as a carpenter demanded focus and precision. But in the evenings, when the shop grew quiet, his thoughts began to wander. Sadness had a way of returning in those hours, creeping in slowly as the light faded. To avoid it, Jonas stayed active. He repaired old furniture, sharpened tools, sanded rough edges long past the point of necessity. As long as his body was moving, his mind stayed occupied. Some nights, he worked until his arms ached. The steady rhythm of planing wood, the familiar scent of sawdust, gave him a sense of control. He told himself he was being productive, that he was using his time well. But beneath the movement, his thoughts continued to race. Memories surfaced uninvited. Questions formed without answers. The faster he worked, the louder his mind became. One evening, as Jonas planed a long piece of wood under the dim workshop light, he noticed his hands trembling slightly. He paused and listened. The shop was filled with sound, the scrape of metal against wood, the hum of his own breathing. Yet inside, there was no quiet. The sadness he had been trying to outrun was still there, pressing against his chest. Frustrated, Jonas set his tools down. He sat on a low stool and leaned forward, elbows on his knees, without the motion to distract him. The thoughts rushed in all at once. He felt exposed, as if stopping had removed a shield he relied on. His instinct was to stand up again, to return to the workbench, but something held him there. He remembered a conversation he had once overheard between two older craftsmen. One had said, "You can sand a piece of wood forever, but if you do not stop, you will never know when it is smooth." At the time, Jonas had laughed it off. Now, sitting in the stillness, the words returned with a different meaning. He realized that his constant movement was not calming his mind. It was feeding it. Each action became another way to avoid feeling what was already present. The sadness did not fade with work. It waited patiently for him to slow down. That night, Jonas did something unfamiliar. He left the workshop unfinished. The tools remained on the bench, the project incomplete. He turned off the light and sat in the quiet, hands resting loosely in his lap. The sadness rose quickly, accompanied by a restless energy that urged him to get up, to do something, anything. Instead, he stayed. He noticed how the urge to move was tied to discomfort. Movement had become his way of escaping feeling. When he did not act on that urge, the energy shifted. It did not disappear, but it softened, losing its sharp edge. Jonas felt his breathing slow. The thoughts continued to appear, but without the constant motion to fuel them. They began to space out. He understood then that avoidance had kept his mind running. Stopping, uncomfortable as it was, allowed the mind to begin its own natural slowing. He sat there until the sadness no longer felt overwhelming. It was present, but contained. The shop was quiet. The night felt still. For the first time in a long while, Jonas allowed himself to rest without earning it through exhaustion. In the evenings that followed, Jonas became more aware of how often he used activity to manage his inner world. The impulse to stay busy arose quickly whenever sadness appeared. It felt practical, even responsible. Work had always given him a sense of direction, but now he could see that at night Constant motion was not bringing peace. It was keeping his mind alert, unable to settle. He began experimenting with stopping earlier. Some nights, he would clean his tools and turn off the light before the urge to keep working took over. Other nights, he sat in the quiet for a few minutes before deciding whether to continue. Each time he paused, the restlessness surfaced immediately. His body wanted to move, to escape the discomfort of stillness. Jonas noticed how strong this habit had become. The urge to stay busy was not just about productivity, it was about avoidance. When he allowed himself to sit without distraction, the sadness returned, but it was different from what he expected. It did not grow stronger. It became clearer, without motion to blur it. The feeling had shape and limits. He sat on the stool, hands resting on his thighs, breathing naturally. The workshop felt larger without the sound of tools, but not threatening. The sadness moved slowly, rising and falling. Jonas realized that what he had been avoiding was not pain, but vulnerability. Being still meant being present with himself. As the minutes passed, his body responded. The tightness in his shoulders eased. His jaw unclenched. The restless energy softened into fatigue. For the first time, he recognized how much effort his avoidance had been costing him. Constant activity had kept him from resting, even when his body was exhausted. One night, Jonas left the shop early and went home while it was still quiet. He sat in the darkened room, listening to the faint sounds of the night outside. The sadness appeared, but without the workshop to distract him. It no longer felt urgent. It felt human. It reminded him of what he had lost, what he had cared about, and what still mattered. He did not try to interpret these feelings or turn them into thoughts. He let them pass through him without direction. The absence of movement created space. In that space, his mind slowed naturally, not because he forced it to, but because there was nothing left to run from. Sleep came more easily on those nights, not because sadness was gone, but because his nervous system was no longer overstimulated. By choosing to stop, Jonas had allowed his mind to return to a slower rhythm. Many people believe that staying busy will protect them from difficult emotions. While activity can be helpful during the day, it often keeps the mind in motion at night. Avoidance, even in productive forms, prevents the nervous system from settling. Buddhist teaching points to the value of stopping, not as a withdrawal from life, but as a return to presence. When we allow ourselves to pause, emotions that arise are not intensified. They become clearer and more manageable. constant movement feeds overthinking. Stillness allows the mind to slow on its own. When we stop running from sadness, it no longer needs to chase us. In that gentle stopping, the body finds rest, not because feeling is gone, but because resistance has ended. Old Marin lived near the edge of the village, where the fields met the forest and the seasons made themselves known without effort. She had lived there long enough to notice patterns others ignored. The way the air shifted before rain, the way certain birds returned only at specific times of year, and the way sadness visited her reliably as the months turned. During most of the year, Marin moved through her days with ease. She tended her small garden, swept the path leading to her door, and greeted neighbors with a steady warmth. But every year, as the nights grew longer and the air cooled, a familiar heaviness settled in her chest. It arrived quietly, without a clear reason. She did not resist it, but she did not welcome it either. It was simply there. At first, many years ago, Marin had believed something was wrong with her. She told herself that sadness returning meant she had failed to move on. She searched her memory for causes, replayed old events, tried to pinpoint what she had done incorrectly. The more she thought, the more the sadness seemed to justify itself. Night after night, she lay awake, convinced that this recurring feeling meant she was falling behind in some invisible progress. Over time, she began to notice something else. The sadness did not come randomly. It arrived around the same weeks each year, stayed for a while, then softened as the season changed. When spring returned, it loosened its grip without explanation. This pattern puzzled her at first. Nothing new had happened. Nothing had been resolved. Yet the sadness moved on, as predictably as it had arrived. One evening, as Marin swept fallen leaves from the path in front of her home, she paused and looked around. The ground was covered in color, each leaf marking a quiet ending. The air was cool, the light fading earlier than it had weeks before. Standing there, broom in hand, she felt the familiar heaviness settle in her chest. Instead of turning away from it, she stayed still. She realized then that the sadness felt similar to the season itself. The world was turning inward, slowing, letting go. Trees were not failing because they dropped their leaves. They were responding to change. The sadness she felt was not a mistake. It was part of a cycle, moving with time rather than against it. That night, Marin sat by the window and watched the sky darken. She did not ask herself why the sadness had returned. She no longer needed an answer. She had seen it come and go enough times to trust its rhythm. It did not demand action. It did not require explanation. It simply asked to be noticed, then allowed to pass when it was ready. She thought back to all the years she had fought this feeling, believing that recurrence meant failure. How much energy she had spent trying to outthink something that was never a problem to begin with. The sadness was not a setback. It was a season of the heart. As the night deepened, Maren felt her body respond to this understanding. The sadness remained, but it felt less personal, less accusing. It was no longer proof that something was wrong. It was a reminder that change moves in cycles, not straight lines. She lay down to rest, the window slightly open, cool air moving gently through the room. The sadness stayed with her, but it did not keep her awake. It moved quietly, like the season itself, doing what it had always done before moving on. As the weeks passed, old Maren no longer met the returning sadness with suspicion. When it arrived, she recognized it the way one recognizes a familiar weather pattern. There was no urgency to change it, and no need to assign it meaning. It was simply part of the landscape of her inner life, shaped by time and memory. She noticed how differently her body responded when she stopped treating sadness as a personal failure. Her shoulders stayed relaxed. Her breathing remained steady. The feeling still moved through her, but it did not carry the weight of judgment. Without that extra layer, the nights felt gentler, even when the sadness was present. Maren began to reflect on how people often speak about emotional healing as if it should follow a straight path. Once something is understood or accepted, it is expected to disappear permanently. But her own experience told a different story. Feelings, like seasons, return, not because something went wrong, but because change is not linear. One evening, as she stood outside watching the wind move through bare branches, Maren felt a quiet appreciation for this rhythm. The sadness that returned each year was not identical. Some years it was heavier, some years barely noticeable, but its presence reminded her of her capacity to feel, to remember, to remain connected to what had mattered. It was not an enemy. It was a sign of depth. At night, when she lay in bed listening to the sounds of the village settling down, Maren allowed the sadness to be there without commentary. She did not try to trace it back to a single cause or turn it into a story. She simply let it move through her, knowing from experience that it would not stay forever. Sleep came without struggle, not because the sadness had ended, but because it no longer demanded resistance. By trusting its cyclical nature, Maren had removed the fear that kept her awake in years past. Many people believe that emotional recurrence means regression. When sadness returns, especially at night. it is often interpreted as a failure to heal or move on. Buddhist teaching offers a different view. It reminds us that all conditioned experiences arise and pass according to causes and conditions, often in cycles rather than straight lines. Sadness returning does not mean something is broken. It means conditions have aligned for it to be felt again. When we stop labeling this as failure, the emotion loses much of its power. It becomes something to be experienced, not corrected. Understanding emotional cycles allows us to meet recurrence with patience instead of fear. Just as seasons change without effort, emotions move in their own time. When we trust this movement, the mind relaxes, and in that relaxation, rest becomes possible, even when sadness is present. Master Linden was known for speaking very little. Students often traveled long distances to ask him questions, only to leave with fewer words than they had brought. He did not avoid teaching. He simply chose his moments carefully. Those who stayed long enough learned that his silence was not emptiness, but precision. One evening, a student came to him, visibly worn. The young man bowed and sat across from Master Linden, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. After a long pause, he spoke. "When sadness comes at night," he said, "I keep asking myself when it will end. The question will not leave me alone. When will this feeling be gone?" Master Linden looked at him without answering. The room was dim, lit only by a small oil lamp. Outside, the sounds of night, insects drifted in and out. The student shifted uncomfortably, waiting for a response. After a while, Master Linden gestured toward a cushion nearby and motioned for the student to sit quietly. At first, the silence felt unbearable. The student's mind filled the space immediately. Thoughts raced. Why will he not answer? Is this not a reasonable question? The sadness he had been describing rose sharply, accompanied by impatience. The question, "When will this end?" repeated itself again and again, each time tightening his chest. Master Linden remained still. He did not correct the student or redirect him. He simply stayed. Minutes passed. The student's breathing began to slow despite himself. The question continued to appear, but its urgency softened. Without being answered, it lost some of its force. Eventually, Master Linden spoke. "Notice what the question does to you," he said quietly. "Each time you ask when it will end, you move away from what is here." The student listened, unsure what to say. Linden continued, "The question is not wrong. It is just unhelpful. the student felt something shift. He realized that every time he asked when, his body tightened. The sadness itself was steady, but the question stretched it forward, pulling his attention into an imagined future. The suffering was not in the feeling, it was in the waiting. Master Linden did not offer a timeline or reassurance. He did not say the sadness would pass quickly or slowly. Instead, he invited the student to sit with the sensation itself. Feel what is here, he said, not what you hope will come later. They sat together in silence again. This time, the student noticed the sadness as a weight, not a story. It was present, but it did not require explanation. Without the constant question of when, the feeling felt more contained, less overwhelming. As the night deepened, the student realized something quietly important. The question he had been asking was not seeking information. It was seeking escape. And by dropping it, even briefly, he felt a small opening, a moment where the sadness did not dominate his attention. Master Linden watched him and nodded slightly, as if acknowledging this understanding without naming it. After that evening, the student carried Master Linden's words with him into the night. When sadness arose, the familiar question still appeared. When will this end? But now he noticed it as a movement of the mind rather than a demand for an answer. Each time the question surfaced, he felt his body tense slightly, as if leaning forward into an imagined future. Instead of following the question, he practiced letting it pass. He returned his attention to what was already present. The weight in his chest, the rhythm of his breathing, the quiet of the room. Without the question pulling him ahead, the sadness stayed closer, more grounded. It no longer felt endless. It felt momentary, even when it lasted. The student realized that asking when had been stretching time. It made the feeling feel longer, heavier, more consuming. By dropping the question, time returned to its natural pace. There was only this moment, and then the next. The sadness did not vanish, but it no longer expanded beyond itself. One night, as he sat quietly, he noticed that the sadness rose and fell like a slow tide. It did not remain at the same intensity. It changed, softened, shifted. This movement had been hidden before by his constant anticipation of an ending. Now, without that anticipation, he could feel the natural impermanence within the experience itself. He also noticed how much energy the question had been consuming. Waiting for sadness to end kept him alert, restless, unable to rest. Without waiting, his body began to relax. Sleep came more easily. not because the sadness was gone, but because there was nothing to hold him awake. When the student later returned to Master Linden, he did not ask another question. He bowed and sat quietly. Linden smiled faintly and said, "You have stopped leaning forward." The student understood. He had learned to stay with what was here instead of reaching for what was not. When sadness returns at night, the mind often reaches for a timeline. How long will this last? When will it be over? These questions feel natural, but they quietly increase suffering. They pull attention away from present experience and stretch discomfort into an imagined future. Buddhist teaching encourages us to meet experience as it is, without waiting for it to change. When we stop asking when, we remove the pressure that keeps the mind tense. The feeling may still be present, but it no longer feels endless. Letting go of the question does not mean giving up hope. It means returning to what is real. In doing so, we discover that emotions move on their own when they are not being chased or measured. And in that simple presence, the mind finds rest, not by force, but by no longer leaning away from the moment. Master Solon taught in a small hall that faced west, where the last light of day filtered softly through tall windows. He often held teachings in the evening, when the sky darkened slowly and shadows lengthened across the floor. Students noticed that he never hurried these moments. He allowed the night to arrive in its own time. One evening, a student approached him after a talk and spoke quietly. "When sadness comes at night," she said, "I try to replace it with better thoughts. I tell myself to be grateful, to think positively, but the sadness stays. Sometimes it feels even heavier." She looked down, frustrated by her own effort. Master Solon listened without interrupting. He then gestured toward the window. Outside, the sky was deepening from blue to indigo. "Tell me," he said, "how does night end?" The student hesitated. "When morning comes," she replied. Solon nodded. "And does the sky become bright because the night is pushed away?" She looked again at the window, watching the last light fade. "No," she said slowly. "It just changes." Solon smiled gently. "Exactly. Night does not leave because it is forced. It leaves because conditions change." He explained that many people treat sadness the way they might treat darkness, believing it must be driven out by light. They try to replace it with positive thinking, hoping that brighter thoughts will overpower the feeling. But this effort, he said, often creates resistance. The mind becomes tense, braced against what is already present. The student felt something settle as she listened. She realized that her attempts to think positively were not bringing ease. They were creating a quiet battle inside her. One part of her mind was generating sadness. Another part was trying to eliminate it. Neither side rested. Master Solon invited her to sit quietly for a moment. They watched the sky together as darkness settled fully. No one tried to stop it. No one labeled it as failure. It simply arrived, covering the land gently. Sadness passes the same way, Solon said, not because we push it out, but because we stop pushing against it. The student noticed how her body responded to these words. Her shoulders relaxed. Her breathing slowed. The sadness she had been resisting softened slightly, no longer needing to defend itself. Solon did not advise her to abandon positive thinking entirely. He only cautioned against using it as a weapon. When gratitude and kindness arise naturally, they can be supportive. But when they are used to deny what is present, they become another form of struggle. As the hall grew quiet and the lamps were lit, the student understood something new. Peace was not something to impose on her experience. It was something that emerged when she stopped trying to replace one feeling with another. The night outside had fully arrived, calm and complete, and in that quiet, she felt a small, genuine ease. Not because sadness was gone, but because it was no longer being forced to leave. In the nights that followed, the student remembered the image of the sky changing on its own. When sadness appeared, her first impulse was still to brighten it, to replace it with something more acceptable. But now she noticed the tension that came with that effort. Each attempt to think positively carried a subtle urgency, a sense that something needed to be corrected. Instead of pushing, she tried waiting. She allowed the sadness to be present without immediately reaching for a better thought. At first, this felt uncomfortable, even risky. Part of her believed that without positive thinking, she would sink deeper into the feeling. But as she stayed still, she noticed something surprising. The sadness did not intensify. It simply existed. She began to sense how resistance had been keeping the sadness active. By trying to push it away, she had given it something to push against. Without that pressure, the feeling lost some of its grip. It moved more freely, no longer held in place by opposition. One evening, she sat by the window and watched the city lights come on as the sky darkened. She did not label the night as good or bad. It was simply night. In that quiet observation, the sadness softened into a gentle presence rather than a problem. Her body responded with a sense of ease she had not felt in a long time. She noticed that when gratitude arose naturally, it felt different. It was not forced or used as a shield. It appeared quietly, alongside the sadness, without trying to erase it. Both could exist at the same time. This understanding relieved her of the pressure to feel a certain way. Sleep came more easily as she practiced this gentle allowance. The mind no longer stayed alert, waiting to correct itself. Without the battle between feelings, there was nothing to hold her awake. Many people believe that calm must be created by replacing negative thoughts with positive ones. While this approach can sometimes help during the day, it often fails at night, when the mind is tired and more sensitive. Buddhist teaching reminds us that peace does not come from forcing change. It comes from allowing change to happen on its own. Sadness does not leave because we push it out. It leaves because conditions shift naturally when resistance ends. When we stop trying to overpower our feelings, the nervous system relaxes. The mind no longer braces itself against experience. Positive thinking has its place, but it cannot substitute for acceptance. When we allow sadness to be present without opposition, we create the space for gentler states to arise naturally. Like night giving way to morning, calm returns in its own time, without being rushed or forced. Naren was known in the village as someone who spent a great deal of time near the river. People joked that she listened to water more than to people. When asked why, she would smile and say that the river spoke more honestly. It did not explain itself. It simply moved. One evening, as dusk settled in, Naren walked along the riverbank with a young visitor who had come seeking guidance. The water was calm, reflecting the fading light. In some places, it flowed quickly over shallow stones. In others, it slowed, dark and deep, barely rippling at the surface. The visitor watched in silence, his thoughts heavy. At night, he finally said, "My feelings become intense. I try to understand them, to name them, to explain why they are there. The more I analyze, the more restless I feel. I do not know what I am doing wrong." Naren stopped near a bend where the river widened. She pointed to a stretch of water that moved slowly, almost imperceptibly. "That part is deep," she said. "The shallow parts rush because they have nothing to hold them." The visitor looked closer. The calm section felt heavier, more substantial, even though it appeared still. She explained that deep water does not hurry. It does not need to announce itself. Its movement is steady and quiet. When people feel strong emotions, especially grief, they often treat them like shallow streams, poking and stirring, asking questions, demanding explanations. But deep feelings, she said, do not respond well to that approach. The visitor listened, unsettled. He had believed that understanding required effort, that if he just thought hard enough, he could resolve what he felt. But standing by the river, he sensed the truth in her words. The deeper parts were not solved by movement. They were held by stillness. That night, after returning to where he was staying, the visitor lay awake as usual. Sadness surfaced, slow and heavy. His mind immediately began to work, forming questions, searching for meaning. But the image of the river returned to him. He imagined stirring the deep water with his hands and watched how that would only cloud it. He stopped thinking and noticed the feeling itself. It was broad, spacious, not sharp. It did not need explanation. The more he allowed it to be, the more it settled. Like the river, it moved beneath the surface, quietly and continuously. The visitor realized that his effort to understand had been disturbing something that was not asking to be understood. The sadness was not a puzzle. It was a depth. And depth, he saw, required patience rather than interpretation. As the night went on, his breathing slowed. The feeling remained, but it no longer demanded attention. He rested, not because he had found answers, but because he had stopped insisting on them. By morning, the sadness had softened, not through analysis, but through allowing itself to move at its own pace. The river's lesson stayed with him. What is deep does not need to be explained to be honored. In the nights that followed, the visitor returned often to the image of the river. When sadness appeared, his instinct was still to reach for understanding, to name and categorize what he felt. But now he paused and asked himself whether explanation was truly needed. Each time he chose to stop analyzing, his body responded with a subtle release. He noticed how different it felt to allow the emotion to exist without being examined. The sadness did not become chaotic or overwhelming. It remained steady, like deep water moving beneath the surface, without constant mental interference. The feeling had room to flow naturally. One evening, as he lay in the quiet, he sensed the sadness shifting on its own. It did not disappear, but it changed texture. What had felt heavy earlier became softer, less dense. He realized that this change was not the result of insight or effort. It happened because he stopped disturbing it. The visitor understood then that analysis had been a form of impatience. He had been asking deep emotion to move quickly, to reveal itself on command. But deep things do not respond to urgency. They respond to space. As sleep approached, he felt no need to interpret what he was experiencing. There was nothing to solve. The sadness, like the river, continued its slow movement, steady and quiet. In that steadiness, his mind found rest. When we meet deep emotion with analysis, we often create turbulence. The mind stirs what is already heavy, turning depth into restlessness. Buddhist teaching reminds us that some experiences are meant to be felt, not understood. Deep feelings move at their own pace. They do not require explanation to complete their movement. When we stop demanding meaning, the nervous system relaxes. The mind no longer interferes with what is naturally unfolding. Allowing depth without interpretation creates a different kind of clarity. Not the clarity of answers, but the clarity of presence. And in that presence, the mind slows, the body softens, and rest becomes possible. Not through understanding, but through patience. Ari was known as a quiet guide who often walked with people at dusk, when the air cooled and the world felt less insistent. She did not teach through long explanations. She pointed, listened, and waited. Many who walked with her noticed that she rarely tried to give meaning to things that were simply happening. One night, a traveler joined her on a narrow path that ran along an open field. The sky was darkening, and a steady wind moved across the grass, bending it in soft, uneven waves. The traveler pulled his jacket closer and spoke after a long silence. At night, he said, "I keep trying to understand what I feel. Every sensation becomes a message. If my chest tightens, I wonder what it means. If sadness appears, I ask what it is trying to tell me. My mind never rests." Ari slowed her pace, but did not answer right away. The wind brushed past them again, cool and indifferent. She stopped and gestured for the traveler to notice it. "What is the wind saying right now?" she asked. The traveler hesitated. He listened closely, as if expecting something hidden. "It does not seem to be saying anything," he replied. "It is just blowing." Ari nodded. "Exactly." They continued walking. The wind rose and fell without pattern, sometimes gentle, sometimes strong. It did not explain itself. It did not justify its presence. It simply moved through the open space, touching everything and belonging to nothing. The traveler frowned slightly. "But feelings are different," he said. "They come from somewhere. They must mean something." Aries stopped again, this time beside a small clearing. She asked him to stand still. "When the wind moves through this field," she said, "do you assume it carries a message meant only for you?" He shook his head. "It is just part of the night." She looked at him calmly. "Many feelings are the same," she said. "They are movements, not messages. But the mind insists on translating everything into meaning." The traveler felt uneasy. He had spent years trying to interpret his inner world, believing that awareness required explanation. At night, especially, every sensation became a clue. He would lie awake, listening to his body as if it were speaking in riddles. Tightness meant danger. Sadness meant unfinished business. Restlessness meant failure to understand. The night turned into a series of questions with no clear answers. As the wind brushed past again, Ari invited him to notice how it felt on his skin. Cool, brief, gone. Did it need interpretation? She asked quietly. He shook his head again. It just passed. That evening, after parting ways, the traveler returned to his room and prepared for sleep. As expected, the familiar sensations appeared. A subtle ache in the chest, a low, steady sadness. His mind immediately leaned forward, searching for meaning. Why now? What does this say about me? What am I missing? Then he remembered the wind. He noticed the sadness as movement rather than message. It rose, hovered, and shifted slightly. It did not present clear words or instructions. It did not point toward action. It simply moved through him, much like the wind through the field. At first, this perspective felt unsettling. Without interpretation, the mind felt idle, almost irresponsible. The traveler worried that by not analyzing his feelings, he was ignoring something important. But as he stayed with the sensation, he noticed something unexpected. The sadness did not intensify. It did not demand more attention. It moved on its own, changing shape, sometimes growing faint, sometimes more noticeable, but never fixed. He realized how much effort he had been spending trying to turn sensation into story. Each interpretation had kept his mind alert, scanning for conclusions. Without that task, the mind had nothing to hold on to. The body began to soften. The traveler lay still, breathing naturally. Thoughts still appeared, but they felt less convincing. The sadness remained present, but it no longer felt urgent or personal. It was not a message about his past or a warning about his future. It was simply part of the night, passing through. As time went on, he noticed that the sensations came and went in waves. Some were emotional, some were physical. None of them stayed long when they were not questioned. The night felt wider, less crowded by meaning. He fell asleep without realizing when it happened. The next evening, he walked again in the open air, feeling the wind move around him. He understood now what Ari had been pointing to. Not every inner movement needs translation. Some experiences are complete without explanation. He felt a quiet relief in this understanding. The pressure to decode himself eased. The night no longer felt like a test to pass or a mystery to solve. It felt like a space where things could move freely without being captured by thought. The traveler knew that sadness would return again, as it always did, but now he understood that its presence did not always carry instruction. Like the wind, it could simply be allowed to pass, touching him briefly before moving on. In the nights that followed, the traveler practiced what Ari had shown him. When sensations appeared, he noticed the immediate urge to interpret them. The mind reached for meaning automatically, as if every feeling required translation in order to be safe. But now, instead of following that impulse, he paused. He noticed how interpretation created tension. The moment he asked what a feeling meant, his body tightened. His breathing became shallow. The mind leaned forward, alert and restless. Without meaning, however, the sensations felt less threatening. They were simply movements, arising and passing within awareness. One night, as he lay awake, listening to distant sounds outside, a wave of sadness surfaced. In the past, this would have triggered a long inner dialogue. Now, he stayed with the sensation. It felt cool and heavy, spreading slowly through his chest. He did not name it. He did not ask why it was there. He let it be. The sadness moved like the wind Ari had pointed out. It passed through without asking permission. Without interpretation, it did not linger. The traveler realized that meaning had been anchoring his emotions, keeping them fixed in place. By removing that anchor, the feelings were free to move. He also noticed that not all sensations were emotional. Some were simply physical. A shift in posture, a change in temperature, the rise and fall of breath. By treating everything as information, he had been exhausting his mind. by allowing experience to remain unnamed. The mind finally had room to rest. As the night deepened, the traveler felt a gentle ease. The sadness did not disappear entirely, but it no longer felt central. It shared the space with other sensations, none of which demanded explanation. His body responded by relaxing, sinking into the bed. Sleep came softly. We often believe that awareness requires interpretation, that if a feeling arises, it must be understood, decoded, or assigned meaning. Buddhist teaching offers a quieter approach. It reminds us that not every experience is a message. Some are simply movements within the mind and body. When we stop turning sensation into story, the nervous system relaxes. The mind no longer stays alert, scanning for conclusions. Emotions are free to move without becoming fixed identities or unresolved problems. Allowing feelings to be felt without interpretation does not mean ignoring them. It means trusting their natural movement. Like the wind, they arise, touch us, and pass on. And in that allowing, the night becomes less crowded, the mind grows quieter, and rest becomes possible without effort. KL was known among a small circle of listeners as the Star Whisperer, though he never called himself that. He simply spent a great deal of time under the night sky. While others brought telescopes or charts, KL came with nothing but patience. He believed that the sky revealed itself only when it was not being demanded to perform. On clear nights, he walked the familiar dirt path up the low hill outside town, where the lights were fewer and the horizon felt wider. The ground remembered his steps. He moved slowly, not out of caution, but out of respect for the quiet. When he reached the open clearing at the top, he laid his jacket on the earth and sat down, facing upward. The stars never appeared all at once. At first, the sky looked almost empty, a dark surface with only a few faint points of light. KL knew better than to judge it too quickly. He stayed still, letting his eyes adjust, letting the night settle around him. Gradually, more stars revealed themselves, some bright, some barely visible. The sky that had seemed empty moments before was suddenly full. One night, someone stood a few steps away from him, arms folded tightly across their chest. They had come with a question they could not seem to put down. "I do not feel peaceful anymore," they said quietly. "At night, everything feels covered. I try to remember calmer times, but it feels like they are gone." KL did not answer right away. He waited until another cluster of stars emerged from the darkness. Then he spoke. Do you think the stars disappeared? Or do you think something is simply in the way? The person followed his gaze upward. Thin clouds were drifting across the sky. Soft and uneven, they passed slowly, obscuring parts of the stars, revealing others. The light did not vanish. It faded, returned, shifted. It feels different when you cannot see them, the person said. It feels like they are gone. Kale nodded. That is how the mind works at night. He said, when grief returns, it covers what was already there. Not to erase it, but to ask for attention. The person sat down beside him, the ground cool beneath them. So peace is not gone? They asked. It feels gone. It is not gone. Kale replied. It is just not visible right now. They sat together in silence, watching the clouds move. The person noticed how their urge to fix the feeling mirrored their urge to search the sky. They wanted reassurance, clarity, proof. But the more they looked for it, the more tense they became. Kale spoke again, softly. The sky does not rush to show itself. He said, if you stare too hard, you miss what is already there. That night, when the person returned home, the sadness followed as usual. The familiar heaviness settled in their chest. Thoughts formed quickly. I was calmer once. Why can I not get back there? What did I lose? The night felt thick, like clouds closing in. But instead of chasing those thoughts, they remembered the sky. They noticed how the sadness felt, not as a story, but as a weight. It moved slowly, like clouds drifting. Some moments were heavier, some were lighter. None of it stayed fixed. They realized then that they had been treating peace as something fragile, something that could be lost forever. But peace, like starlight, did not depend on constant visibility. It existed beneath conditions, steady and unchanged. As the night deepened, the thoughts softened, not because the sadness disappeared, but because it no longer felt final. The person stopped asking where peace had gone. They let the feeling be as it was, trusting that what could not be seen was still present. Back on the hill, KL continued to sit beneath the sky, long after others had left. He watched clouds pass and stars return, again and again. Nothing in the sky hurried. Nothing needed explanation. The light was patient. Those who learned from Kael did not leave with answers. they left with a different relationship to the night. They understood that darkness does not cancel what exists beneath it. It only asks us to wait without fear. And for those lying awake, watching thoughts drift like clouds across the mind, this understanding offered something quiet but steady. Peace does not vanish when sadness arrives. It waits, unmoved, present, ready to be seen again when the mind softens enough to look without strain. In the nights that followed, the person who had sat with Kyle began to notice a subtle shift in how they related to sadness. When grief returned, it no longer felt like an erasure of peace, but like a veil moving across something steady. The feeling was still there, heavy at times, but it no longer carried the fear of permanence. They noticed how often their minds searched for reassurance. Each thought asked in its own way, "Is this how it will always be?" When that question arose, they remembered the sky. Clouds did not ask permission to pass, and they did not stay to make a point. They moved according to conditions, revealing and concealing without intention. At night, lying in bed, the person allowed the sadness to exist without checking whether peace was still present. They stopped scanning their inner world for signs of calm. This change, small as it was, brought relief. Without constant checking, the mind began to rest. They noticed that some nights were heavier than others. On those nights, the sadness felt thick, like a low cloud. But even then, it did not feel absolute. It had shape and movement. It changed subtly from moment to moment. The person realized that their previous suffering had come not from sadness itself, but from the belief that it meant something essential was lost. One evening, they stood outside briefly before bed and looked up at the sky. Clouds were moving slowly, obscuring most of the stars. Still, they could sense their presence. The darkness felt less threatening now. It was no longer interpreted as emptiness, but as cover. Sleep came more easily in this understanding. The mind no longer stayed alert, waiting for proof of peace. Without that vigilance, the body relaxed. The sadness softened enough to allow rest, even though it had not fully passed. When grief returns at night, it often brings the belief that calm has been lost. The mind interprets the absence of peace as proof that something essential is gone. Buddhist teaching offers a gentler view. It reminds us that peace is not a feeling that must always be visible. It is a stable quality that can be temporarily obscured by emotion. Sadness does not cancel peace. It covers it, the way clouds cover stars. When we stop searching for reassurance and allow experience to be what it is, the mind relaxes. Without strain, clarity returns on its own, trusting that peace remains even when unseen. Changes our relationship to the night. We no longer panic when sadness appears. We wait. We rest. And in that resting, the mind softens enough for what was always there to reveal itself again. Quietly, without effort. As we come to the end of tonight's journey, it may be clear that what you have heard was never meant to solve grief or silence the mind completely. These Zen stories were offered as gentle companions, not instructions. They point again and again to the same quiet truth. Grief does not return at night to harm us, but to be seen with less resistance than the day allows. Overthinking often feels like a problem of the mind, but what these stories reveal is something softer. The mind spins because the heart is holding something tender. When we try to think our way out of that tenderness, we stay awake. When we allow it to exist without interrogation, the mind slowly loosens its grip. Nothing needs to be finished. Nothing needs to be understood perfectly. Across each moment, each character, each small action, the message remains steady. Silence does not make grief stronger. Stillness does not mean failure. Sadness is not a sign that you are moving backward. It is part of a living cycle, returning when conditions are right, leaving when it has been allowed to rest. Like clouds, like seasons, like deep water, it moves without asking permission and without needing explanation. These Zen stories are reminders that peace is not something you create by effort. It is something that reveals itself when you stop forcing the night to be different from what it is. When you stop asking when grief will end. When you stop turning every feeling into a task. If tonight your mind is still active, let that be so. If sadness is still present, let it sit beside you without a name. You do not need to fix it to deserve rest. You do not need to understand it to be at ease. Sometimes, the most compassionate thing you can do is allow the night to hold you exactly as you are, trusting that calm has never left. It has only been waiting, quietly, to be seen again. Let your breath slow down, like wind slipping through tall trees. Let your forehead loosen, your eyes quiet, your jaw unhook and soften. Down your shoulders. Let them fall like leaves settling on warm earth. Arms, wrists, fingers, all easing into stillness. Chest, belly, hips, opening the way a forest opens to evening. Thighs, knees, feet, softening into the ground beneath you. Now imagine a soft forest glow, the kind that appears just before night fully arrives. It drifts toward you, warm, steady, kind, and settles over your body like a blanket woven from quiet air. Let that glow touch anything inside you that still shakes, not to erase it, but to calm it, to help it rest on the forest floor of your breath. Let your awareness rise like a thin mist moving upward between the trees. Above you, the night sky opens. Stars scattered like seeds of light. Your edges soften. Your thoughts loosen until you're drifting between branches and sky. Light, far at peace. Thank you for ending your day here, with softness, with breath, with quiet. Let sleep arrive like night settling over the forest. Gentle, steady, calm. And if you want more nights of this gentle peace, you can follow the Sleepy Zen channel. So our paths meet again in this quiet space. Sleep well. Sleep well.